Support comes from Trinity Health of New England's Neurological Services, providing expert 24-hour stroke care, comprehensive headache clinics, and world-class MS care close to home. Visit trinityhealthofne.org/neurology.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Did you get a little misty-eyed when your kids went back to school this week? I did. But going back to school is not as easy as remembering to pack a lunch and a mask. Some households have immunocompromised family members. And this year, Connecticut schools do not have to offer virtual learning. So what decisions will these families have to make? It's the focus of one story in a series this week by Connecticut Public Radio's investigative unit, the Accountability Project. We'll talk about those stories today, and you can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Joining me now from Zoom is Walter Smith Randolph, investigative editor and lead reporter for the Accountability Project. Walter, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Lucy. It's great to be here.
So we know that your education series, you and your team, hit several important issues, but I wanted to start with an update on the resignation of UConn President Tom Katsouleas. You and your reporters covering that this summer. What's the update related to the relationship the former president had with the board?
Yeah, so we've been digging into that relationship by looking through emails and through FOIA requests and also talking to some folks that are on campus. But it just seems that the former President Tom Katsouleas, it just seems like he didn't go the way that the Board of Trustees was used to. It seems to be like there was a lot of backroom dealing and that the meetings are kind of pre-orchestrated. And it seems like he didn't go along with that. And that's where the rift came in.
How unusual is it for the way the Board of Trustees operates at UConn versus other boards, Walter?
It seems like a lot of universities do the same thing so that way, there isn't any disagreement that the public can see. But again, it is supposed to be a public meeting. People are supposed to attend, and there's also supposed to be some discussion about some of these agenda items. And that's not what's happening. That's happening behind closed doors. And when you get to a meeting, and as you'll hear in our story, you'll see, there's this multi-million-dollar package and everyone just agrees on it. There's no discussion.
So this wasn't the way that Tom Katsouleas was used to operating. And we know that he put in his resignation just 2 years after becoming president. So a lot of attention on that and this rift between him and some members of the board. I'm thinking, not good optics for a university that needs to recruit a new president. But meanwhile, there's an interim president. What can you tell us about him?
Yeah, he's an interim president. I can tell you that he is familiar with University of Connecticut because he has been leading UConn Health, which includes the hospital, the dental and medical schools, and the research facilities for about 6 years. But he does not have really an academic background. So that kind of, raised the antenna of some folks on campus. But Jackie Rabe Thomas was on campus when he was driving around in a golf cart, helping students move in. And no one really wants to talk about the past. They kind of want to move forward and say, we're looking towards the future.
Right. And that's Dr. Andrew Agwanobi. Something that struck me in the story when we think about public employees, now that he's interim president, he'll be making over $800,000. Walter, we're in the wrong business.
Yes, we got to become university presidents.
But there has been attention on the contract for former President Katsouleas as well. And so he, like the other president we had, Susan Herbst, able to now be faculty. When you and your team were talking with legislators, do people see this, the contract being too generous when they become president, decide to leave, and then they can stay on and have a pretty sweet deal as faculty?
Yeah, it's not unusual, for a president to step down and to stay on campus. This just happened with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, their journalism school dean. She stepped down and she's going to remain on the faculty. But the difference here is that his contract said that if he resigned without cause, he would be entitled to post-presidency benefits, including a rate of pay equal to the highest base rate payable to a 9-month faculty member. So basically highest paid faculty member. And, we talked to some legislators and they were not happy about that. They call it an elevator clause and they said moving forward, they don't want that in the contracts.
I've lived in Connecticut for a while now, and I feel like, often we hear from some lawmakers maybe not happy with, certain decisions that are being made at UConn, or maybe not happy with a particular decision by the board. But is there any appetite for lawmakers to really get involved? The reason I'm asking is public money supports this university, our taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, it seems like this, again, raised the antenna of many people. And so I think that they will be keeping a closer eye on what's happening. The person that we talked to was Senator Slapp, and, he is on the Higher Education Committee, Senate Chairman of the legislature's Higher Education Committee. He said that there were, Katsoulis had bigger plans for scholarships and tuition. Slapp also used to work for the UConn Foundation, which is the school's fundraising arm. So he knows a lot about what's going on. So I just think this, puts UConn kind of in the spotlight for people to be watching and to see how this all plays out.
So I'm guessing there might be more to this UConn story, Walter?
Oh, yes. We're still looking. We're still waiting for some emails to come in as well. So Jackie Rabe Thomas will probably have a part 3 of this ongoing saga now.
This is Where We Live. With me on Zoom, Walter Smith Randolph, who's investigative editor and lead reporter for Connecticut Public Radio's investigative unit. That's the Accountability Project. I mentioned this series of education stories that you rolled out. And let's talk about, we know that the state is mandating that teachers and staff have the COVID vaccine. Who did you speak with, and what did you learn from school districts about how they're monitoring this?
Yeah, so Jackie Rabe Thomas and our data reporter Jim Haddadine, they went to Hartford Sand Elementary School and spoke to a teacher named Victoria Shears. She's a resource teacher, specializes in special education, and she was, moving back into school. We also have some sound in that story from Governor Ned Lamont. And so we also talked to the Hartford superintendent about how this vaccine mandate is being rolled out. When we started this story, we sent out a survey to all the superintendents across the state to say, ask them how many of your staff members are vaccinated, how are you keeping track of it? And this was actually before the governor issued the mandate.
So when you put out that survey, how many of these school leaders actually knew what their staff vax rate was?
So 45 folks responded to the survey, and only 10 of them said they knew for sure exactly how many of their faculty members, or their school workers were actually vaccinated.
10 out of 45.
Said they knew with certainty how many staff members had received the coronavirus vaccine. And of those who were sure, the numbers all were around 75 to like 85%.
Do you and your team get the impression that, school leaders, are a little rushing around to fulfill this mandate? But I'm surprised that they didn't expect this to be coming, considering, when we think about all the conversations about how to keep children safe, especially those that aren't able to get the vaccine right now, Walter.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like they were running around trying to figure out, because it creates another burden for some of these school districts, because then it becomes, well, who's going to check the vaccine mandate? How are we going to check this? And then who do we report it to? And those are all things that that the state and the state education department, state health department, they're still trying to figure out, because their deadline is until September 27th. Now, the teacher that we did speak to, she said that it helps reassure her, makes her feel safer. But again, some of these superintendents and some of the administrators, say that this creates an extra burden for them. And also, it kind of came last minute. It came just a few weeks before school started.
Right. You mentioned Victoria Shears. Let's hear from her right now.
I feel like I can relax a little bit more. Mistakes happen. A kid's mask might break, and you just never know, and I just feel like I have that extra layer of protection. So I definitely think it was the best decision for myself. Mm-hmm.
And you can hear that she feels reassured. It sounds like she had a mask on when you were talking with her.
Yeah.
When we talk more about the decisions for parents and families, even staff, to head back to school, we know that some vaccines, even though they're available, not everyone can take them. And you decided to focus on immunocompromised family and the decisions they have to make, because there is no mandate for schools to have virtual learning. What did you find out?
Exactly. The state told school districts, earlier this summer that they were not required to have a remote learning option. And so we talked to two families in a Fairfield school district where they have students in the school district, but they're, for various reasons, their families are immunocompromised. And so with the school starting, they were trying to figure out if the Fairfield school district was going to offer some type of remote learning option. And the school district offered one student who's going to be in the fifth grade 5 hours of tutoring a week. And then another student who's going to be a junior, they offered him 10 hours of tutoring a week because he's special needs. But most students, they go to school for about 30 hours a week. So the one mom put her kid into a national online academy, but she said she had to tap her son's college fund in order to pay for that. So the state does not have a statewide virtual academy like some other states do, like Massachusetts has one. There's about 30 other states across the country that have one. And so Connecticut is trying to come up with a plan for that, but they don't have to present the plan to the legislature until 2023.
So we've been in this pandemic for 18 months, and the plan is not due until 2023. That's really interesting when we think about, ways to serve all families in our state. You also spoke to a child about, his mom, and I wanted to just play this clip because when we think about all the stuff on children's minds, having to worry about their family, shouldn't be something that should be front and center. But let's hear from Lane Mayville.
If I went to an in-person school, I would probably be very terrified because I know that my mom could get very sick and potentially die.
And tell us about his mom.
Yeah, that's Lane Mayville. He's 10 years old. So his mom is Marnie White. She has a compromised immune system. So she did take the COVID-19 vaccine, but she didn't develop antibodies. And she actually, crazy enough, she actually is a PhD. She teaches epidemiology at Yale School of Public Health. So she's been keeping an eye on the pandemic. And so, her immune system isn't where it should be. And so she's afraid that, and Lane as well, he's 10 years old. She's afraid that if he goes to school and brings something home, she could potentially die. So for her, it feels like she's choosing between her son's education and her health.
And then her child has to think about, not wanting to get mom sick. That's a lot for a little kid to bear, Walter.
Yeah, I mean, he's 10 years old and he's thinking about his mom potentially dying. Personal note, my mother passed away of cancer when I was 10 years old. So I know what that's like to have to deal with something like that. And that's something a child should never, ever have to think about. That's robbing them of their innocence. And so Marnie, Dr. White, she's very upset because she's been battling this for an entire summer, even at the beginning of this year, because she just knew that the vaccine was going to be available for children. And she's worried about what would happen if her son brought something home.
We've been focusing on immunocompromised families, but you've also looked at, students with disabilities and how school districts responded to them, making sure they had an education over this last year. And what did you find as we get into this, what is it now, start of a third year where we're thinking about the pandemic and how to serve all kids, Walter?
Again, our all-star team, Jackie Rabe Thomas and data reporter Jim Haddadine, looked at the numbers that they were able to get from the State Department of Education, and they found that last school year, 1 out of every 4 students with autism were chronically absent, which was twice the rate compared to before the pandemic. Meanwhile, 1 in 3 students with ADHD and over half of those with emotional disturbance missed excessive amounts of school.
Wow, 1 out of every 4 students absent. You spoke to a mother, Kiamari Sotillo from New Haven. Her oldest son has autism and ADHD. She said it was hard to get her son to even agree to online learning. Let's hear from her.
To him, learning happens in person. Some people thrive off being in a classroom, interacting in person, hands-on, touching the materials. So he struggled. He has really struggled. And I feel like this year it's been a wash. He really didn't benefit.
So she was talking about the last school year. And so what does that mean for the start of this year, Walter?
Well, for her, her situation is a little different because her son graduated high school during the pandemic. But he's supposed to get some services to transition to his career. So he did sign up to take courses on how to become a plumber, but he's still waiting to hear back if those courses will be in person. The data basically found that, a lot of these students who have special needs are struggling with the remote learning. I mean, assessment rates just came out, and we saw that special education students who were learning remotely, the proficiency rate was about 7% for English language arts and 4% for math. You look at the number for students who are in regular classes, remote, that's 25%, and then for math, and then for English language arts, that was 40%. So you can see that there's a big, big difference.
We've heard from a variety of circumstances for families about the decisions of whether or not their child can go to school, and if not, waiting on the state to come up with guidelines for a virtual academy, like you mentioned. Other states, we see that families with children with disabilities severely impacted their learning in this pandemic. So when we think about the complaints from families, do you anticipate that there will be lawsuits from families that say that the state is not supporting them as they should, as the law requires?
Well, it depends, because Jackie was also able to get some data from the complaints that parents make to the state, but there was a big drop off last school year. The state saw a 2/3 drop in the number of complaints being filed. The state says, oh, well, you can't, make, broad assumptions about this. But when you talk to people who, work for Children's Advocacy Center and places like that, they say that a lot of parents are just kind of fed up. Instead of filing a complaint or maybe filing a lawsuit, they are going to try to figure out the best way they know how to try to get their kids some help. We spoke to a family that comes from a wealthy town in Connecticut, and instead of filing complaints, they just decided to spend thousands of dollars to get the education that their students need. So people right now, I don't know if they're thinking about lawsuits and complaints. They're just thinking about, I need help now. And what can I do? When you also think of, Dr. Marnie White, same thing she did, she is complaining, of course, by going to school board meetings, but nothing that's, she did file complaints and appeals with the State Board of Education, but she gets to a point where she goes, well, school's starting and I need my kid to be in school. What do? I got to figure something out.
Right. Well, we hope to have the new education commissioner on Where We Live, and we'd love to ask her some of the questions related to the series that you and your team have put out. Walter Smith Randolph, again, is investigative editor and lead reporter for Connecticut Public Radio's The Accountability Project. Walter, just remind our listeners, if they want to reach you, what's the best way to do so?
We have a new tips hotline. So that is TIPS at ctpublic.org. That's tips at ctpublic.org. So you can email us your story idea and we can take a look at it.
Wonderful. Walter, always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we talk about the pressing psychological and mental health needs of students. You can join us too, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The start of the school year is an exciting time, but we can't forget the last 18 months have been anything but normal. So what sort of support will children need from their school districts? My next guest says there's a definite need because new findings suggest a doubling of rates of disorders such as anxiety and depression among children and adolescents during the pandemic. On Zoom right now is Dr. Sandy Chafulias, who's a Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Educational Psychology. She's co-director of the Collaboratory on School and Child Health at the University of Connecticut. Sandy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good morning.
So when we think about rates of diagnosed mental and developmental disorders, what do we know about them before the pandemic and now that we've been in this 18 months, Sandy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this new study that we were just referencing talked about this doubling of rates. But I think it's first important before we get into those details to talk about the fact that the rates were high prior to the pandemic. So this doubling is extra concerning. And by the doubling, there was a brand new study just out last month in JAMA Pediatrics that basically combed all of the literature from all the studies from January of 2020 to March of 2021 to look for keywords around adolescents and children, depression, anxiety, and COVID. And they found 29 studies. And so they kind of they did a meta-analysis where they combined the results from across all those studies and found that our rates are about 25% for depression and 20% for anxiety. So that's about 1 in every 4 to 5 children. And that's double what we saw generally.
As a parent, that really is concerning, right? Because you think about, you try to do everything right for your child. And, none of us were expecting this pandemic. We're all trying to do the best we can. And now that their kids are back in school, most of them, it's important to ask, what are school districts and schools doing to support children who are dealing with anxiety and depression? Can you talk about some of the factors that lead to that, Sandy?
Absolutely. So, there's so many reasons, right? And so those estimates that we just talked about are generally, in general across the population, but they're going to be different based on different contexts, right? So depending on what's happening in the community, what's happening all around us. So there are lots of reasons. Economic stressors, physical challenges are certainly the contributors that will help tell us what those prevalence rates will be. But then let's talk about the extended isolation, including school closures, as you just mentioned, and then the tremendous grief and loss that have been experienced. So it's not that there's one reason, there's a whole lot of reasons that are kind of all coming together into a perfect storm.
And when we think about children, they are sponges, right? And so if they notice mom and dad are stressed, if the family is grieving the loss of a loved one, the children, they're feeling that as well. But the way they respond to that can be different than the way you and I do. And so can you talk through, when children are dealing with anxiety and depression, how is it presenting?
Oh, sure. So it certainly looks different across ages and stages. As you just mentioned, in adults, I don't know about you, but I've probably been more irritable or agitated over this past 18 months at certain times, or more hypervigilant. In younger kids, though, that might look more like crying or a regression of behaviors like thumb sucking, nightmares. And then in our adolescents or our older children, we might see withdrawal, substance use, again, irritability. Across all ages and stages, though, we're definitely seeing sleep disturbances.
And so if parents are noticing this in their child, don't second guess, don't say, it's kids just being kids, this is normal. If they feel like their child needs help, it's okay to ask for help. How do they do that, Sandy?
Well, first of all, it's absolutely okay to ask for help. I do think it's important first to acknowledge, though, that some of the things that we're seeing and all feeling is completely normal given what's happening around us, right? Why would we expect everything to be exactly the same as before? The concern or the issue that parents need to be paying attention to, and teachers and schools as well, is when children aren't able then to do the things that we're expecting that they would be able to do. So when it becomes something that they're not able to get up in the morning and start their routine the way that we're expecting, that's when we start to say we worry. But anytime you have a question, you certainly should be reaching out to, now that schools are back, certainly understanding who the support staff are in your school, whether that's starting with your teacher, who can then connect you with the school psychologist or a social worker or a counselor, or your pediatrician if you're in a community-based setting, or any other community agency that you might be able to connect with.
You're hearing Dr. Sandy Chafulias, who is a distinguished professor of educational psychology and co-director of the Collaboratory on School and Child Health at the University of Connecticut, as we talk about increasing rates of anxiety and depression and other disorders in children. They may be going back to school, but what are the support services out there for them within their school? You can join us, too, if you have a question, if there's a program that you notice your child's school has been using to help with these socio-emotional needs, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Sandy, you and your colleagues are training future school psychologists. And when we think about reaching out to a teacher who might be able to refer a child to a school psychologist, not all schools have that staffing up to the levels that will be able to respond to these increased needs. Can you talk about what you found out?
So sure. Again, this is an issue that's been around as long as I've been a practitioner, which is a long time ago. The shortages or the recommended ratios from our national organizations for school psychologists, and pretty similar for school counselors as well, would suggest that we don't have the numbers in schools, so employed by schools, that are recommended. NASPRA, the National Association of School Psychologists, for example, recommends one school psychologist for every 500 students, but the estimates suggest it's really more like nationally about one to every 1,200 students. So if you think about that, it's like instead of having 25 students in your class, it would be like having 60.
Wow. So talk through more when we think about the staff that's needed in schools. Oh, who are we talking about? So it's psychologists, social workers, counselors.
Yeah, we definitely need the staff in schools, and we also need the community connections to build our partnerships within our local context and our agencies, because we can use schools as the primary setting for accessing, or kind of being like the coordination hub. So if a school can't provide something that a child needs, maybe it's more intensive than what a school can offer, school should be the place to help identify those needs and then connect to what's needed.
We've heard a lot in this last year and a half concerns about learning loss. But when I think about young children and the social skills that they learn and how this has all impacted them developmentally, can you talk about that and how school staff can respond when they see a child that might be a certain age but maybe is lagging in a particular developmental skill that in normal times might have been there?
Sure, absolutely. So there are lots of articles that came out and lots of news stories this summer that talked about academic learning loss. And I think they put the estimate somewhere around 4 to 5 months of loss. And every time I would read one of those articles, I would get like angry on the inside and say, okay, well, that also means that it's the same for social skills, right? So if we expect 4 to 5 months of loss in academics, we also need to expect that for the social, emotional, and behavioral skills that we're expecting our children to have. So there's kind of two issues that are involved in this gap in social skills. One is this opportunity. We need these opportunities to teach skills that were never there to begin with. So if you think about it, all of those kindergartners that are coming into first grade right now, should we expect that they have all of the social skills of a first grader when they haven't had the opportunity to do things like take turns, share, pass things nicely, organize things, when you come in, put your shoes here, your red folder here, all of those things. So we do need to expect that, just like on the academic side, that we provide the time to learn, particularly with our youngest children. And then for all of us, even us as grownups heading back into the workplace, make sure that we have the opportunity to practice, because we're a little rusty, right? It's like getting back on a bike after 20 years, maybe. I don't know when the last time you rode a bike was. But so it's two things. One is the opportunity to teach it, the skills that were never learned. And then two, to give the time to practice the skills that we had.
So we've been talking about learning, not just a learning loss, but thinking about the developmental skills. But talk about the connection between that and when we think about a child's mental health or physical health, Sandy.
Yeah, so it was really interesting. We were working in a school toward the end of June, and we were doing some pilot projects around building kind of these skills and some social skills, but around building positive emotion skills. And we just on off chance embedded some arts activities into those programs. And we had gotten a note back from the teacher, first grade teacher at the end, and she had exclaimed at how important it was that we did both of those things, because she had realized how far behind some of her kids were with basic things like think of cutting and gluing and coloring. So I don't know why it surprised me at the time, because I kind of know this, but I said to myself, oh my gosh, you can't disconnect anything. Everything is interconnected. It's the same reason why we're seeing mental health challenges, right? It's not because we have just mental health challenges. It's because we're experiencing physical challenges, environmental challenges, financial challenges. So the idea that learning and health are connected, are interconnected and intertwined is something that we're certainly understanding now more to a degree than we ever have before.
I'd love to hear from some parents who may be making certain observations with their children, and now that they may be in school, how do you see your school or teacher responding to those needs? The number 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We learned that obviously mental health professionals, counselors, social workers, there aren't enough for children in schools across our country. But when we hear that, what resources or support do teachers have that they can be prepared for this school year to respond to those needs that they're seeing, Sandy?
Sure. So that's, I think, the million-dollar question and the perfect question, because although I certainly advocate that we need to have more school mental health professionals in schools, I also think that what we need to do is be engaging in a prevention focus. I've talked in the past about this thing called behavioral vaccines. So just like we all are going out, or we all should be going out to get our physical vaccines, there's an idea behind the idea of behavioral vaccines. So the small things that we do for everyone, the whole population, the general population, that we all need right now. And they really simple things like a warm greeting or a written note like, hey, great job on the show today, right? Or for kids, especially, and adults, aerobic playtime. So that recess time. Or it could be something as simple as intentional breathing exercises. So these really small things that everybody should be doing and engaging in that don't necessarily require a school mental health professional. They maybe can help you learn how to do those things, but everyone in the school, from the bus driver, custodians, teachers, can help build this foundation where we have a really strong core.
The NEAG School of Education, a lot of teachers coming out of these programs in Connecticut schools, also social workers and school psychologists. And I'm wondering, when we look at how Connecticut schools fare, we hear about shortages nationwide. But in terms of how Connecticut has responded to this, what have you heard from your colleagues about what schools in our state are doing to respond to these needs, Sandy?
Well, they're doing a lot. So first, I want to give a big shout out to all our school staff that are out there right now, because it has been, as you had started in your beginning of your show, a very challenging 18 months. And the summer is no exception for our educators who have been trying to pivot as the routines continue to change, right? To make sure that we're ready to be as supportive as we're able to be with the resources that we have. So, everyone has been working on social emotional programming, what that's going to look like. Some schools have been creative in being able to give their principals autonomy to say, take that first week and do with it what is best for for what's best for your school and the kids that are in your school. A lot of it is focused on reconnection, play, re-engaging in what would be a normal school experience.
I like that idea that, thinking about how to structure class time and giving teachers more flexibility just to connect with their students and not worried about the next following the certain curriculum or getting them to their next class, Sandy.
Yeah, how about some fun, right? We probably could have used fun before the pandemic too, but thinking about fun. And it could be something as simple as, I see this recommended a lot is like a 2x10 strategy. So it's taking 2 minutes for 10 days to focus on 1 or 2 or 3 students and really connect and build that relationship with them. And then you rotate through your class till you've got through everybody, but you focus on a targeted few at a time to really solidify that relationship. And there's no like predetermined set of questions. It's just like hanging out and talking and connecting, learning about what's going on in their lives.
I feel like there's always it seems like the catalyst for these kinds of conversations about taking time and to connect and to ask people, how they're feeling. It's always related to catastrophic events, right? So my producer, Tess, she remembers after the Boston bombings, her teachers spent time in the classroom checking on them, talking about what they've seen and what they've all been through. But it is interesting when we think about this pandemic. It's been traumatic for many people. But, lessons that we can learn, Sandy, as we, think about getting out of this pandemic and how to be more responsive just in general.
Yeah, I think you just hit the nail on the head in terms of we need to be doing this with outside of the pandemic for in perpetuity. I like to think that maybe the pandemic has highlighted our attention to the need to do these and that we should be able to sustain them over time. Everyone needs to work on adaptive coping, right? Positive coping things. And we know that it's very important that we build our tolerance for uncertainty, because that's kind of what life is, pandemic or no pandemic. And so really simple strategies like making sure we use humor, learning how to accept, seeking supports when we need them are really important.
We talked about there being shortages to have additional mental health staff in schools. But the good news is there's all this money, this federal money from the American Rescue Plan in towns, in communities. Do we know if schools are able to use this money to help boost staff to address these mental health needs of children, Sandy?
That would be a yes and a yes, I think. So I think the most recent plan that I had read that had been approved was New Hampshire's, actually. And so there are 3 bullets, and we can talk about Connecticut in a second, but there are 3 bullets were expanding after school programs. 2 was supporting student and educator social, emotional, and mental health needs. And 3rd was supporting educators. So that kind of hits everything that you've just talked about. Connecticut is also was approved prior to this time, but solutions were very similar in terms of addressing learning loss. That's expected. But a second major bullet is student social, emotional, and mental supports, building infrastructure, building community connections, boosting engagement, strengthening family and community partnerships. Those are good things.
Something I noticed my children's schools trying last year is they had these online programs, socio-emotional learning programs, but I didn't see either of my children really connecting to this. And so I'm wondering, what does the data show in terms of, do these programs help students, Sandy?
They certainly help, but they have to be implemented well. So it's not that you can just take a program off a shelf and say, hey, put it in X school and it'll work for X, Y, and Z. We need to understand what the need is in that school or community context and then do a good match. And it doesn't have to be, again, a fancy program. It can be really simple strategies like we just talked about with this 2x10 connection. Maybe your children would have liked to have been in a private Zoom room and have a chance to connect more so. And that would have been what they would have benefited most from.
You're hearing Dr. Sandy Chafulias, who is a distinguished professor of educational psychology and co-director of the Collaboratory on School and Child Health at the University of Connecticut, as we're talking about how schools should respond to children and their mental health needs. You can join us, too. We're going to take a short break. Here's the number, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up tomorrow, the U.S. military mission in Afghanistan ended August 31st. The State Department says 123,000 people were evacuated, but not everyone got out. On the next Where We Live, we hear from Connecticut residents who have relatives still waiting to be evacuated, and we talk with local refugee resettlement agencies about their efforts to extricate and settle Afghan refugees in Connecticut. And do you have questions about how you can help? We hope you join us tomorrow. Now, today we're talking about how schools can respond to the mental health needs of children now that the school year is underway. My guest today on Zoom, Dr. Sandy Chafoulias, Distinguished Professor of Educational Psychology and co-director of the Collaboratory on School and Child Health at the University of Connecticut. We were talking about how when children are different ages, how these stresses manifest differently in them. And so if we're talking about a child who's 5 versus a high schooler, what are some best strategies to check in with them and talk with them about how they're feeling, Sandy?
Oh, that's a good question. So I would say ask the teachers, right? So with the younger kids, I'm on the floor, right? Sit on the floor. Engage in with art activities while we're having conversations. With our older kids, it has to be maybe a little bit more casual, where you're shoulder to shoulder walking down the hall or chatting rather than directly saying, hey, what's wrong with you or what's going on? That's not the best way to engage. So it really depends on the age and stage and also the individual child.
It's interesting. My son will be 11, and I already noticed that he starts to not be as open about talking about things as he was when he was 5 and 6. And so what are some guidelines for parents who have adolescents? They notice their kids are clamming up. They don't really want to talk to mom and dad.
Sure. So I would say that of all my, this is my own personal experience with my 3 kids as well. And my friends, we talk about the idea of liking our turn in the drive to different activities, in the carpool, or even just having conversations, because it makes it a more relaxed space rather than sitting down at the kitchen table to, again, have a serious conversation, just kind of making it more casual. Let's go for a walk, and then we chat on the walk, or text. I don't know, you're about to enter the age of texting, probably more than talking at some point. So, it's again, just not being confrontational, I think, is the big spacer, particularly as they get into teens. Non-judgmental, really just being calm and saying, I'm here, I'm listening, and boy, that really stinks. What's happening right now, and what are you thinking about this?
That's good advice. Thank you, Sandy. When we were talking earlier about there being a shortage of mental health professionals in schools, you and your colleagues have also found that there aren't enough culturally and linguistically diverse school psychologists. And so can you talk about the need there and how to address that? What's happening in other states? Is Connecticut being responsive?
Sure, absolutely. So the same trends that we see in our school mental health staff are the same things that we see in our educator staff. So, there's a big push right now to make sure that we're using a multi-pronged strategy. So everything from recruitment of talented people into teacher ed and school psychology programs to starting in high school, even, because I don't know about you, but I didn't really know what a school psychologist was until I was getting ready to apply to grad school. So getting out there and telling people what these jobs are and how cool they can be to work in is an important pipeline kind of programming thing space. And then again, making sure that in our community context that we are connecting with our community-based providers. We shouldn't expect that schools can do everything on their own, but we can tap into our community and our community members to help in the delivery of what we think are these best practices as we move forward.
What about encouraging children to ask for help? If they're maybe being sent or recommended to see the school psychologist or a therapist, that can be scary. They might think they're in trouble. And so what are some good approaches to have children be comfortable talking with an adult about their feelings?
That's a good question. And I think, again, that's one that maybe might get a little bit easier for us as our society is progressing as a result of COVID. And then even something as simple as the Olympics that we see this summer, and the conversations about being open to talk about mental health are much different than what we saw maybe just a few years ago. So the first thing is to make sure that you're in your school, that students know who they are and where they are. So back in my practitioner days, we would spend the first week going around to classrooms and just chatting with kids and talking to them about who I am and where I am and what I do. So that's a first really important step. And again, the second part was, if you do see something that's of concerning, not to make it seem alarmist. Like you can, let's say you're having a conversation with the child and you're concerned about something that you're hearing. You don't freak out about it. You say, hey, that's really interesting. I'm glad that you shared that with me. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Would you mind if I connect you and we go talk to someone else about that? And hey, I'd like to walk you down to that person's office. Let's go together if that's what's needed.
When parents are used to taking temperatures these days, and you're not supposed to send your child to school if they're sick with fever or some other illness, but what would you say to parents in terms of rethinking, taking a sick day because they know their child might be struggling? They need a mental health break. How would you advise parents to think about a sick day for this?
Well, I think, again, as we talked a little bit earlier, I think everything is connected together. So why we would separate sick as meaning only physical health and wellness, we should also assume that that's connected to mental health and how we're socially, emotionally, and behaviorally feeling. So in other words, I would be a supporter of saying that that sick time or those sick days, or maybe we should call it something other than sick days, right? Maybe wellness days could apply across all our domains of well-being.
Right.
What we need to be careful of, though, is just to make sure that it's not being used to reinforce what we would call escape behaviors or the opportunity not to re-engage. So let's say that you had somebody, a child that was really socially anxious about going to school. If we keep letting them not go to school versus putting in baby steps or a plan to get us ready to get back into school, then we could create a bigger problem.
Sandy, we just have a couple of minutes left, but, all this talk about being responsive to mental health needs, the stakes are high because we're seeing, suicide rates, especially for children. It's really scary. And if you could talk about that for us.
Yeah, it is very scary. And again, what I would reinforce here is that we do need to be worried about the things that we're seeing at the more intensive mental health needs. But we can't forget or we can't neglect the foundation of wellness. So, mental health and well-being, it's not just the absence of disease. So we're not just trying to decrease anxiety and depression and suicide rates. What we actually want is a mentally well society, right? We want our kids and ourselves to be well. And we do that by having a really strong foundation of, I talk about it as the 4 Ps in the work that I do in terms of making sure that our physical setup is there. So making sure we have nutritious food, good sleep habits, all even access to technology. Then we talk about it as having predictable routines. So we have control and we have certainty when we have predictable routines. And then we have positive relationships, which we already talked about. And then pleasure, which we also talked about, is putting fun into your day. So if we put those 4 Ps as our foundation, we can reduce the intensity of the severe mental health problems, but we also make ourselves as a society well. We have well-being.
Well, Sandy, this has been a really important conversation. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
We've been hearing Dr. Sandy Chafoulias, a distinguished professor of educational psychology and co-director of the Collaboratory on School and Child Health at the University of Connecticut. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Tess Terrible produced today's show. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. We'll be back tomorrow.